Hello, and welcome to the Conversations in Time podcasts from the ORC. In this podcast, the guys will be talking about historical what-ifs, or counterfactual history for the aficionados in the audience.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of Conversations in Time from the ORC. I'm John N.
And I'm Ian G. Even remember who I am.
Just a quickie. You know the old thing about kit and caboodle, or
the old thing.
Thing? That saying about kit and caboodle.
I can't know of it, but yes.
Yeah, I was just wondering what a cat caboodle was. But anyway, there was a kit. Anyway,
but it's not a kitty cat, presumably, is it? It's a kit.
Kit and caboodle.
It's your kit, like your washing kit or your.
Makes you wonder what's caboodle anyway.
I don't know.
Moving on.
Is that a caboose or is that something completely different? But anyway, yeah.
Right. So we're back into the ORCU, or the officially retired counterfactual universe. Where are we today, then, Ian?
Well, I think it's quite remarkable that we've got 6 podcasts in, although this may not be the 7th because we don't always publish in order. But we've not mentioned Hitler. How the hell could we have got so far as we've got with counterfactuals and not mentioned Adolf Hitler? So we're going to address Adolf Hitler today, probably not for the last time. But then, there's not many podcasts that have anything to do with history or modern social issues that don't eventually involving Adolf Hitler. There is a saying, isn't there, that in the UK in particular, that most arguments always end by somebody referencing Hitler. Either you're like Hitler or you're doing something just like something or other. But anyway, let's not worry too much about having an argument. So I thought what we do today is look at the what ifs of the surprising number of assassination attempts against Hitler had actually come to fruition in as much as they were successful. No great loss to society and or humanity, obviously, but unfortunately he didn't die by assassination. And I thought specifically, rather than doing the obvious one, which was the Operation Valkyrie, as per the reasonably famous film, Tom Cruise, we wouldn't do that one. We're not going to go into detail of the assassination attempt, but we do one that was roughly in April 1943, where a German military officer attempted to destroy his plane, which obviously wasn't successl.
He was. I was looking up the 1943 attempt, and you're right. There was another attempt made in 1939 as well, which failed. It got the look of the devil, that bloke. It was
indeed, but I mean, on the other hand, nobody's ever attempted to assassinate me or you, I imagine. But
but these were serious assassination attempts that didn't work. I mean, even the one in 1943, there was another attempt made a week later, and that failed as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think ultimately it was down to the cowardice of the people attempting to assassinate him, because ultimately, if you want to assassinate him, walk up to him and shoot him in the back of the head. Or, even the Stauffenberg one, which was a bomb of reasonable sophisticatedness, he left the room before it blew up and then somebody moved it. Had he not left the room and ensured that Hitler was sitting on top of it, he would have succeeded.
Well, I suppose at least the bomb went off, whereas the plane one, the bomb didn't go off. I think it was another bomb the week later, and that didn't go off either.
No.
It was, man. Anyway.
So let's assume that, so we're talking about mid-43-ish. The reason I thought it would be slightly more interesting, because obviously the Stauffenberg plot was August 44, July 44. That was post D-Day. The Russians had cleared their own territory, were advancing into Poland. The end of the war was not in doubt. There was massive ramifications if Hitler had died, but militarily nothing really would have changed. Militarily, the Germans were defeated. It was just a question of when and where and how. 1943, slightly different. I mean,
you sure it was 40? Sorry, I got it down as 42. You sure it was 43?
Well, you can Google it if you want, but
I'm just going to quickly Google it, because for some reason I was looking at
sound effects in the background of somebody.
Yeah, me typing quickly. Yeah. I wish I could type quicker.
Even Quarter would be a good one.
Right, that's 20th of. That was that one.
Yes, talk amongst yourselves.
Sorry about this. Yeah, because I think one of the key things, if I'm wrong, then fair enough. It was just what I was looking at. Right, it was late 42. So I was right.
Okay.
It's not 43. So all I'm saying is that one of the key differences in terms of if you say it's late 42 rather than it being in early 43 is the state of the Russian front. Is that was would have been, well, would have been several months earlier, so the German army wouldn't necessarily have been in the same scenario as it would have been in May 43. That's all. Anyway, let's. So now we know it's 42.
Well, we might have to. I'm not convinced it was 42. Because it's not. I've just googled it and it says March 13th, 1943.
I'm looking at well, I'm only looking at Wiki, and it's saying, yeah, maybe I'm wrong then. I don't know. The plan was in 42. Sorry, yeah, maybe it's 43. Yeah. Oh well, we can ignore all of that then. So the plan was started in 42, and then it was attempted in.
Yeah,
43.
well, yeah. My recollection vaguely was it was 43 because it was slightly before El Alamein and stuff. So, but.
Anyway, right.
Anyway, so let's let sometime between the end of 1942 and the spring of 1943, Hitler was assassinated. I mean, bear in mind that the Eastern Front tended, not completely, but tended to stagnate during the Russian winter anyway. So there weren't any massive major offensives. That's not to say that they weren't fighting, but there wasn't any massive attempts at maneuver warfare. Obviously, there was the Russians were fighting the Germans in Stalingrad. That was a turning point in the war, and that was actually just in I think they surrendered in January 43. So again, it would have an impact. But let's presume it's 43. So let's say that El Alamein.
It was 13th of March 43. I'm looking at okay. And the other one was 21st of March. Was another one. That was a suicide bomb attempt, but Hitler left early, but so he didn't set it off.
I'm not sure a suicide attempt works when the person's not there, but anyway.
Yeah.
It's more just like suicide. But anyway, so let's recap. So early 43, spring 43, the Allies are in North Africa, but they haven't won. What the point? The Germans haven't surrendered. The German advances in Russia have stalled and failed with massive casualties. The Russians haven't fully got their mojo together yet, but they're getting there in terms of how they're going to deal with the Germans, and will start advancing and pushing the Germans out of Russia. So it's mid-war. And let's presume Hitler's dead.
Yeah.
So the obvious question, who replaces him? Well, the presumption is that somebody who replaces him isn't a Nazi, because the presumption is that the rest of the criminals are rounded up. Whatever happens to them is another story. Let's not worry about that. But the Gorings and the Himmlers and the various hangers-on are rounded up by whoever's doing the coup, which is elements of the German army.
Are you sure that's something that would happen? In terms.
Well, that was certainly the plan in 1944, which was significantly more advanced in the sense of it was a coup d'état attempt, it's all attempt. So if it was a coup d'état attempt, you don't leave number two sitting around waiting to take power unless number two is on your side. You see what I mean? Not that Hitler had a designated successor as such, but
he did. I thought Goering was the
well, he was
deputy.
Yeah, he was, but he was derided and seen as a figure of fun, not a serious person. He was a drug addict.
But wouldn't the transition, having a pliant alternative to Hitler, be easier than getting rid of everybody and then trying to start everything from fresh, in terms of...
Well, not really, because the Nazi experiment, for want of a better words, was a collegiate affair. I mean, Goering and Himmler and the various other people have been with Hitler since the early 1920s.
I know, but what I'm saying is that so Hitler's gone and then Himmler goes. Are the SS just going to, just pick on that one for now. So the SS just back down and do nothing?
No, the presumption is that there's a coup d'etat and they're disarmed. I mean, the SS at that point... I mean, let's talk about the SS versus the Waffen-SS. So the Waffen-SS is, the fighting SS. Honestly, that's what it means. So they're off in Russia. They're essentially soldiers. They're a bunch of nasty thugs, but they're less political than the SS. So the SS, just as the SS, is centered around Berlin and supports various Gauleiters and what have you in various towns. But their power is very much centered around Berlin. So if you round them up, and you need troops to do that. I mean, this was the presumption in the later attempt, was that the Wehrmacht would mobilize troops around Berlin to take over key points, disarm the SS, explain to them it was all you were doing this for your best benefit, shock and awe. Wouldn't be a lot of fighting. It'd just be a question of taking over. And then what you do with them afterwards, what you do with the foot soldiers, you do very little with them. What you do with the leaders, well, you either try them, hang them, shoot them, or quietly lock them up somewhere. But you're right. Potentially, there's two options here. There's a pure assassination attempt. Bang, he's dead. What the hell do we do now? Or there's a coup d'état. So we could look at both, because obviously they would result in different. And
well, I think the other thing as well is that these things never go according to plan. Hitler's dead. Oh, okay. We'll explain to them it's the best thing, and then they all go, yeah, you're right. Let's crack on and do something different. I think that there would have been, an element of civil war, or
potentially.
Because there's time between Hitler. I mean, what was Himmler on the plane? We're just talking about the SS, so I don't know whether Himmler was on that plane. That would have been.
No, I don't believe he was. But I mean, when you say
he's pretty paranoid anyway as a individual.
Indeed. But when you say nothing goes to plan, you're right. But coup d'états generally work or they don't work. They don't. There generally isn't a compromise.
No, but the SS, as you say, is centred in Berlin.
Mm-hmm.
So the army isn't necessarily centred in Berlin, and one of their functions was as a security function, wasn't it, around Hitler and Himmler?
Well, indeed, but the army, the German army had, was huge. It was, But it had second-rate troops stationed around Germany. The so-called, I think it's called not the Land Army. It had a specific name, but it was second-rate troops, or it was troops who were deemed hadn't finished training, or were I think the Germans had a term for it. It was called the Ulcer and something like Foot Army, because it was people who, it was soldiers, generally older soldiers who had ulcers, which nobody understood in those days, in terms of how to treat them. Certainly weren't where it was bacteria and such like, or were unable to march, which was always a thing in any army in those days. They had a variety of problems. So it was a large force around Berlin of second-rate troops. But again, second-rate troops turning up and saying, all your guns are in the armory and you don't have access to them. And by the way, Hitler's dead and we're taking over, and I've got a legal document saying that I can do so, and all the rest of it. I mean, the odd thing about Germany was that, despite the fact that they were all criminals, they were very keen on having laws that they just made up that justify their criminality. So, it's possible that turning up with troops and you don't have guns and you've got an order signed by somebody or other, the chief judge of wherever, would would be enough. But maybe not. But you're right, civil war is certainly an option in that. But
well, I think I just think that there would have been some sort of conflict. It might not have been major, but I think that they wouldn't necessarily just bent over, especially if you couldn't get to Himmler immediately. So if Himmler's around for any period of time after Himmler's assassination and an attempt to remove him from power.
Yeah, but Himmler, I mean, this is the thing. Himmler was not a well-respected individual. In fact, none of them were, by and large. I mean,
I know, but the SS was something that was under his personal.
Well,
command.
Indeed, but like most criminals, what's the first thing a criminal thinks of? Themselves. So if you go to the senior
but he would have employed people who were like-minded and arguably would have been, on his side. Would they have?
Well, yeah, but which way? But they would blow in the wind. These types of people blow in the wind. As soon as you see which way the wind's blowing, and it ultimately depends which way the wind is blowing. If they see that it's going to work and they're going to go down with Himmler, they very quickly jump ship. These type of people always do. I mean, these people had many of these people were not ideologues because they wanted to. They fervently believed in this nonsense. They were, by and large, opportunists, criminals from the 1930s, not literal criminals at that point, but they were opportunists from the 1930s who saw the way the wind was blowing, thought, well, if I get in part of the Nazi party, I get custom, I get kudos. If I, part of the Nazi party, Hitler's Guard is the SS, I get more custom kudos. If that all goes, what's left? Well, okay, so the army's taken over. Well, okay, I know many of them. Or I've got Himmler. Now, Himmler was chicken factory.
Well, let's move on from Himmler then. Farmer, we can disagree on the scale. I mean, ultimately they would have lost even if there had been some conflicts, just because of the scale and the numbers that they would have been pitted against. The other areas of the military would, like you say, weren't interested in that type of thing, so would have folded.
Well, they had
would they care? Probably
the Luftwaffe, ironically, was the most Nazified aspect of the German forces. So it's interesting because obviously they had Göring as their leader. But the army had an oath of allegiance to Hitler. They didn't have an oath of allegiance to the German people or the German constitution, such as it was. So their oath of allegiance was gone. So Hitler was dead. I have no, so they're malleable, and by and large, it would be the army, you would imagine, or the Luftwaffe. Well, the Luftwaffe doesn't have a force that it can deploy to put down a coup d'état. It's dispersed all over the place. It's big. It's in airfields all over the Western Europe, and it's still a little bit in North Africa. What can it do? The Kriegsmarine is very small by any other military standards. It's mostly the submarine force. They're not a major player. Yes, they can send people in trucks here, there, and hither and thither.
Well, in terms of the Navy, the key activity was the Battle for the Atlantic, wasn't it, at that period? And it wasn't. They were just on the cusp of losing it in 43, because if you think about the build up to D-Day, it required the build up of D-Day was middle of 43 to 44. The Battle of Atlantic was won by the end of the summer of 43. The Germans essentially withdrew. That's not to say that the U-boats went out there, but they essentially withdrew. So they were losing it at this point. But again, not massively politicized. The Luftwaffe was, but really because it had been a tool of propaganda in the 1930s. So it was, nice to have bombers flying around and all the rest of it over parades. So the Luftwaffe was politicized. Its ability to influence stuff limited. The German the Wehrmacht, the army, had lost its oath to its leader. The leader was dead. And again, it was plotting against him and had been all the way through the war. Not the entire army, obviously, but elements of. Oh, yeah, many of the senior officers, yeah.
Yeah. Although it was mostly a question of blowing in the wind, as we've talked about. I mean, many of the generals accused were just waiting to see what happened.
Although one of the things that you could argue is interesting, they never dobbed anybody in. Well, in terms of the other army, because one of the things that these conspirators did was to try and get other army officers involved in the attempt.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of them declined, but they didn't then go to the Gestapo saying, "Oh, this guy's trying to get me into a killing coup."
But then it was you could imagine the conversations weren't a question. Will you help me assassinate Hitler? It was, we must do something. Where this we can't go on like this. And again,
no, that's right. But even that was something that, in theory, you're supposed to go and.
Well, absolutely, repulse. But then it was the officer corps that
they were sticking together.
It had no truck per se. This is a slightly odd thing about the German Wehrmacht, is that it had an oath of allegiance to Hitler, but not to the Nazi Party. So, and it had disdain for the Nazi Party because it was a bunch of thugs. It had disdain for Hitler, truth be told, because he was a little corporal, wasn't he? But they were loyal to themselves first of all. But then that was true at the top level, the medium level of the Wehrmacht. From those that had existed in the late 1930s were by and large all dead. So the ones that were coming through, the junior officers and the middle rank officers were products of the Nazi regime. I'm trying to say that with your proper teeth in, but so it's quite complex. The loyalties ebbed and flowed, but there was a massive degree of cynicism about loyalty to whom. Why have I got loyalty to this person? This person's gone. Who have I got loyalty to now? Well, let's wait and see. In our counterfactual, because obviously Hitler didn't go, unfortunately.
Yeah. Okay. So the coup's happened. It's going to take potentially a couple of weeks. Let's at least extend it that long to be finalised, and we end up with Germany's run by some military, generals.
Yeah. So this is the
council,
thing
however you want to describe
it. Yeah, I think it's important to remember that. Even though some of these people, not so much the ones that we're talking about in 43, but they were involved in 44, Stauffenberg being the obvious one, these people were made out to be different things after all, in reality they were. Because people, the West wanted to have Germany back in the fold. So it created these myths of the good German, Stauffenberg the good German, Rommel the good German. These people were German nationalists. These were people who were quite comfortable with Germany invading countries. What they were uncomfortable about was them not winning, and they weren't uncomfortable particularly with the Holocaust. They didn't do anything about it. So these were German nationalists. So they weren't on the side of the West. They obviously apparently went on the side of the Russians, but they weren't in favour of the West versus the Russians. They were in favour of Germany. They were mostly concerned about the fact that Germany was not winning in 43, hadn't lost, but had all but lost, just didn't know it, or it knew it, but it wouldn't accept it.
Yeah.
So,
I
despite
mean,
what you might think about, these people that have been lionised in films and such, like, they were German nationalists. In fact, what that meant they would do is open to conjecture. But it's
okay.
not.
So when you look at 43, then the military council's in charge.
Uh-huh.
There's obviously one key front that they need to address urgently, which is the Russian front, because obviously there's no D-Day, there's no Allied advance in France and whatever, and North Africa hasn't moved in. Have they moved into Italy yet?
Well, they have. Well, they wouldn't. No, they wouldn't have moved into. No, they didn't move into Italy at that point. But
So there's one key front
Yeah.
that is causing, the worst problem that they've got, which is the defeat by Russia.
Yeah.
And what do we think they would do? Would they try and sue for peace? Oh, you're saying that they're still militaristic. They're not necessarily out for peace. So they obviously don't want to lose.
Well, I think they do two things. So the thing to bear in mind is whoever's in charge. We don't need a name. It doesn't really matter. We have no idea who the name is. I mean, but what they would try to do is win. They would do two things. They would try and win in the east, and then they would try and break up the alliance. So they would try again to win. But what does win mean? How do you win against a country that stretches a third of the way around the planet? I guess you've got to knock out that country's ability to fight, to fight back, to make war. Again, how do you do that when many of the factories have literally been put on the back of railway trucks and sent beyond the Urals as they were?
But what could they do differently that wasn't done?
Well, nothing is
the real world.
That's the thing, but that doesn't mean to say they wouldn't try. So I guess the difference is they would be more attuned to the realities of fighting a war. So the famous or the infamous thing that Hitler always or never did or didn't allow was retreat. Yes, they obviously did retreat, but he wouldn't allow a strategic retreat. He wouldn't allow a general to say, "I'm going to withdraw from this town because it's indefensible," to the hills behind the town, which are very defensible. He would never allow that. He would fight. He'd say, "Fight to the death." Now, in reality, people do not fight to the death very often unless they're culturally attuned to that. Japanese, and even then, it took a long time for them to be persuaded to do that over decades. It wasn't always a facet of their culture, but but that said, that when you say to somebody you will fight to the death, that basically means you can't retreat. It means you either surrender, you're killed, or you're wounded. And they would, and Hitler was notorious for that. So they would allow, if an attack failed, they would allow a retreat to happen. If the Russians attacked, they would allow those troops to escape to more prepared positions. Sounding quite Liverpool-puddly now. To prepared positions, which means that you live. He who fights and runs away lives to fight another day.
That's right. But the data or the outcome of that potentially. I mean, let's face it. They would know the issues in terms of fighting the Russians. The volume of troops, the volume of equipment, all this type of stuff was something that is still going to be there, and they understand. I'm pretty certain they would understand that was a problem that they had to overcome, and at most, wouldn't they only slow them down?
Well, I don't know. It's interesting.
I can't see how they would stop them. There's a tide coming, and
possibly. But the thing is, they certainly wouldn't win. There's no.
No, they're not going to.
There's no silver bullet. You attack Kursk and great. So you attack Kursk and take Kursk, and you've taken ludicrous casualties, but you've won in inverted commas. Yeah, what next? But could you? It was only 20 years previously. There had been a stalemate in the Western Front, for example. The Eastern Front. They won the Eastern Front by stoking revolution in Russia. So stalemate wasn't out of the possible. If it's 1,000 miles from Berlin and you've got stalemate, that certainly would have suited Hitler to one degree or another, because he was keen on constant war to gee up the population. He had this concept of Germany should always be at war. So that sort of masculine Nazi bullshit where the only successful outcome of a population is to produce people to fight war. So that would have suited him. Would it have suited the generals? It depends how long the stalemate lasted for.
But one of the things that the generals still would want would be to have a Germany that was still German in their mind.
Well, it would be, because in 43 they were a long way from the German border. The Russians hadn't even got as far as Poland by that point. So if one
of the options potentially is some sort of peace settlement. I'm trying to think of.
Well, that's the second thing that they would try to do, isn't it? Because all right, so they try and
not necessarily with the Russians, but certainly with the Allies to
indeed.
then stop the Russians.
Yeah, so indeed, so the next, so let's presume that they've stopped the Russians. So the battlefront, it would never be like France. It would never be a line of trenches from the Black Sea up to the Baltic or further north into the Arctic. So it's too big for that. But let's presume that a stalemate has occurred that you could sustain without having to do huge attacks. You're just building up defences a little bit, but like today, Ukraine and Russia. It's to a certain extent it's a stalemate. That a little bit of artillery going back and forward, the odd bombing raid and all the rest of it. But yeah, as you say, well, how do you win a war doing that? Well, you can't. And you've got the Allies mopping you up in North Africa. As many German and Italian troops were captured at Tunisia as were captured in Stalingrad, but people seem to forget that for some reason. So you've lost North Africa. Where the Allies are probably going to attack Italy. They're eventually going to attack Northwest Europe through France. You want to stop that. So as you say, you go to them and say, look, we've got rid of Hitler. Nasty piece of work. What can
Let's talk. Yeah, because
at
the end of the day, they've got mainland Europe, arguably, or most of it. The Allies aren't there. They're on the edges, the UK and Africa. Yeah. And ultimately they want to stop the Russians. I think that would be their key objective, one way or another. And like you say, militaristically they could do something, but it wouldn't hold forever. Having some form of appeasement to let's take a breath and figure out what we can keep and what we've got to give back.
So I don't think that the minimum thing that the Western Allies would ask for would be a return to pre-war borders. So that would be, you go back to Germany then. That would be I have a couple of thoughts on this. I don't think the Western Allies would negotiate with them. I mean, we'll come back to that and I'll explain why I don't think they would do that. But even if they did, the minimum requirement would be to go back to, you need to give up Norway, Belgium, Denmark, Netherlands, France, the Baltics as well, I guess. Although traditionally, certainly Britain tried to keep out of the Baltics, but not the Baltics, the Balkans, Yugoslavia as it was then, Greece. Certainly, they would want them to give up Greece and Yugoslavia. Some of the little peripheral countries, Albania, perhaps they would be less concerned about. I don't know, but so that would be the minimum requirements. Would the new German government, assuming that we go down this path, would they be happy with that? I doubt it. I can't see negotiations, and I think that would be the minimum requirement. I can't see that the Germans would give that up, because they would have the Russians, albeit 1,000 miles away. The Russians rebuilding, rearming with their new tanks and planes and stuff, still getting American and British land-lease stuff, and then they'd have the British. All right, the American army wouldn't be as big as it subsequently became, arguably, but it might be. There's the British army and the French army resurrected, and the American army sitting on their border.
But I understand that. But when you start negotiating, let's assume they started negotiating. So Hitler's gone. So the main evil focal point has gone, and then you've got people who are in theory more amenable to stopping the war, and then it just comes down to, well, what's left? And you could have people who are going, all right, well, we're going to have to give them something. Some compromise, because that's one of the things that you get with negotiations if you're not in a position of strength. And the Allies aren't necessarily in a position of strength at that point if Hitler had gone. Not
on paper, they're not, but they know the relative capabilities of the American, British Empire and Dominion economies. Versus the German economy. So there's no doubt that the Allies are going to win. It's just how many people have got to die.
But it depends on how much effort you want to put into winning it. This comes down to the Hitler factor, doesn't it?
Well, indeed, but
and that would have gone. Now, unless you actually make whoever becomes in charge of Germany evil like Hitler, it's going to taint your perspective of how you're going to move forward. Surely the Americans would have been going, all right, well, Europe can start looking after itself. If you've got somebody who wants to have peace, what do they care about whether part of France is part of Germany or not part of Germany and that type of stuff? That's getting into it.
They cared enough to declare war.
But that was Hitler.
Well, no, but America.
Yeah, but he's gone, hasn't he?
Yeah, but this is why. Well, all right, but well, let's go back to America.
There have been impact of Hitler going. Otherwise, it doesn't make any difference whether he goes.
I can't speak a huge amount of what America would do. I can speculate, but Britain, the people of Britain would not accept a negotiated peace. There's too many people. But bear in mind, the Russians are still in the war. You look what happened at the general election in 1945. The British people were as left-leaning as they've ever been at that time, which means not particularly left-leaning at all, but as left-leaning as if they would not stab the Russians in the back. No British Prime Minister would survive. Churchill wouldn't want to do it, full stop. But let's say they got, again, massive counter fractures. Let's say they got rid of Churchill and replaced him with somebody who would be prepared to do it. He wouldn't survive like 5 minutes in Parliament. He wouldn't survive 5 minutes in the next general election. That would not be the British state would not negotiate with Germany. So even if the Germans were prepared to move all the way back to the French border, the Dutch border, etc., I don't believe the British state, and I'm using that term so they were removing individuals because we know Churchill wouldn't go for it. And many of the people who became famous after the war wouldn't have gone for it either. And all the names gone straight up my head. But Attlee and the guy who was Prime Minister during the Suez Crisis, whose name escapes me, but he became Lord Avon, but I can't think of his real name. But anyway, and Harold Macmillan and all the rest of them who were senior positions in Churchill's government, none of them would have bought that. So who was forming the government? Nobody's forming the government, so Britain wouldn't go for it. Would America go for it? Well, that's a problem if Britain, still wants to go for it. I don't know. I mean, obviously, America's still fighting Japan, as is Britain to one degree or another. They could refocus it away to the Japanese war, given because it was Europe first in the real factuals. Whether they move away to Japan first.
Well, especially when the American public would have been getting some media attention on this, so Hitler would be dead. The Germans are suing for peace. The American public would want to move towards Japan. That just seems like normal human.
Yeah, but what sort of peace are the Germans suing for?
Well, I'm just talking about the general population in terms of the approach or the potential thinking that could be.
Yeah, but the devil's in the detail, isn't it?
But do they care about the detail? I mean, I don't know.
Well, it's whether they care. It's not. I can't remember when we'll have to Google it, but I can't remember when the election is in America. If we don't
end up with something different happening, then it doesn't matter that, as I said before, if that Hitler died or not, that it's still going to go ahead and D-Day is going to happen and all this type of stuff. Yeah, but
it depends on how much time we've got. But when you take Hitler out of the equation, things do change. It's the question of.
But it only feels like military strategy is the only thing that changes.
Well, it is by and large because I think that's the case. I mean, the classic one where nobody was prepared to wake Hitler up on D-Day. He didn't get up to 1 o'clock, and only Hitler could release the Panzer divisions. And he wasn't even out of his bed till 1 o'clock and didn't even know they've invaded. And even then, he didn't believe it was a real invasion. He thought it was a feint. So there are huge aspects, but I don't actually think the Allies would treat a nationalist German government who would decide. And also, the thing about politicians don't like people who assassinate other politicians. It's something visceral in a politics. I mean, you sort of see where I'm coming from.
But you could say they're getting rid of him because he's a pretty evil bloke and we didn't want to be here. But we've got to retreat with decency.
That's not why they're getting rid of him. They're a pretty nasty bunch themselves. They're getting rid of him because he's incompetent. You could argue that getting into war is incompetent, so they wouldn't have got into war in the first place. But that's debatable. Yeah,
Although there were, you say that, but there were other assassination attempts before Germany.
Correct.
Had the tide turned on them, and they were winning and.
But not by
rosy.
Not by the German army. There wasn't. Not by the officer class, privileged class that existed before the Nazis. There were the political opponents, which you sort of get as well. So let's deal with a couple of the counterfactuals that are front and centre. Give your opinion in a second, but I don't think the Germans would be prepared to withdraw to the German border. So that would be it's not going to happen then. I don't think the British state would stab the Russians in the back and negotiate with them separately. They had many a chance to do this and they never did it anyway. What the Americans would do, the Americans might refocus on Japan and defeat Japan first. I think that's the political aspect of it. So that's not to say that there wouldn't have been counter opinions in the UK, because obviously, if you don't have to fight the Germans, you don't have to have 200,000 people killed, which in terms certainly in Britain would have been the case had it not happened. But the question is then, if you're not, if you've gone into this huge war, you've allied with the Russians, the Germans have changed the head of state, and all of a sudden you stop fighting them. No, I can't see it.
Well, it's a counterfactual. So ultimately,
indeed.
We'll never know.
But let's presume that. So let's move on, and let's say that they did keep fighting. I think they could probably keep the stalemate in Russia going quite a long time, probably indefinitely, if they didn't have their economy being destroyed by the RAF and the United States Army Air Force, if they didn't have British and American and French, Canadian troops banging on their back door. They could have kept the war with Russia going indefinitely, as many wars do. I mean, Korea versus South Korea, or North Korea versus South Korea, Russia versus Ukraine, although arguably given the right sort of weapons, Ukraine could push them out. But that could have gone on indefinitely. But D-Day would have happened. Would the leader of Germany, whoever he might have been other than Hitler, have control over the panzer armies, panzer divisions? Probably not. Would they have mobilized straight away and got onto the beaches at D-Day? Possibly. Probably not, because all the communication had been destroyed. Would subsequent battles... Hitler kind of lost interest in France for a while because he obviously had the Russians knocking on his front door, and then the Allies, again, it was a degree of stalemate for about 2 months in Normandy. Kind of lost interest, and it was letting the generals run it themselves, and even when they were running it themselves, they still lost. So again,
but you're saying that there were some key decisions, tactical decisions that Hitler made, which were wrong, which you could say if there was somebody who has got some military background. Is unlikely to make, and therefore would have made a difference. And
I know it's going to annoy you, but I always work on the bit. Before I annoy you too much, the other one, you're right. The other example is the Battle of the Bulge. That was Hitler's idea. Let's attack through the Ardennes. No one's ever done that before, have they? And try and split the British and Canadian armies from the American armies, and take the port of Antwerp, stopping the flow of supplies. That was a crazy idea, because all he did was send his remaining armies out of their prepared positions into manoeuvring positions where they ran out of fuel, never had the fuel in the first place, were chopped up piecemeal by the Americans eventually, and the British and American and British air power. Had he not done that, he could have fought the war probably for another year.
But I mean, we're almost saying that that's likely to have happened though. So the Battle of the Bulge wouldn't have happened. We're saying that there would have been a much more, because of tactical retreating from the Russians, there would have been a more robust defence of the Eastern Front.
But what happened in August 1945? The Americans dropped a bomb on Japan. That bomb was an atomic bomb. That bomb was destined for Germany. They'd have dropped it on Berlin, and that's always my trump card. Because that bomb was. It was 100% designed for Berlin. They got all the Jewish scientists. Not that they were doing it for that reason, but it was just, they had no interest in Japan.
If you've already said that the American interest would have focused on Japan anyway, then why would they?
Because they're still fighting the Germans. So they're still fighting the Germans. They may not invade Italy, so they might say, well,
but it depends on how well they're doing and how many casualties they.
Well, indeed, but even if they're not doing very well, the atomic bomb comes along and says, all right, let's finish this war in Europe. Let's drop a bomb in Japan. Let's drop a bomb in Berlin. Bang. And the interesting thing is, where Hitler, assuming he was alive, had he not been killed in an atomic bomb attack, he would never surrender. A German nationalist would surrender. A slightly more rational, nasty piece of work, rather than the complete maniac that Hitler was. A rational, nasty piece of work would surrender if somebody was there to surrender.
That's what I mean. You don't. I mean, that's quite an interesting concept in terms of what could happen if the Germans had carried on fighting and hadn't sued for any type of peace.
That's
to delay what the inevitable is.
Well, indeed, that's the ultimate. What if D-Day had failed? Well, the B-29 would have dropped an atomic bomb on Berlin 12 months later. That's exactly what it was designed for. Why would they not? I know it's a what if, but why would they not? It's all right, humanity perhaps, but they're already firebombing hundreds of thousands of people to their death anyway, and so that the humanity.
I don't know. I mean, it's an interest. I assume that there is documentation somewhere about the plans for dropping a nuclear bomb on.
Yeah, there is
in Europe.
Yeah, 100%. It was always. I mean, that's why the British were in handed over all the previous.
Not that you see that in Oppenheimer, but anyway.
Well, you do. Well, I've not watched it, to be fair, but you do in the BBC
Oh, I
version
know,
of
yeah,
it,
but yeah,
albeit
the
for
British
about
version of it, yeah, for 5 minutes. But
albeit for 5 minutes. But to be fair, that was probably about the. I mean, 5 minutes isn't, but the
actually in Birmingham University, wasn't it?
yeah, all the British,
the atomic
all the
bomb.
British, indeed, all the British input was theoretical. It was the.
Oh yeah,
It was the industrialization of the process which was the key.
It's got to start with the theory first, though.
Well, no, I agree. But to a large extent, anybody can write a load of stuff on a bit of paper, but it's a bit like penicillin. Nobody remembers the people who actually made it a repeatable process. I can't remember who they were myself, but I know there was somebody. But yeah, before we get into rounds of completely different topics, I think we're coming to the end. I think in summary, and I know I do this all the time, but I think there would be huge differences. But I don't. The salient point.
But you say huge differences, but arguably there's only one significant difference, and that's an atomic bomb on Berlin.
Well, no, but you say that. The huge difference. I don't think the Allies would have invaded Italy, because I think the Americans would have been a bit wary about just pushing things forward for the sake of it. The point of invading Italy was, well, you've got these armies sitting in Northern Africa. What do they do with them now? Well, if there's no Hitler and there's a possibility of negotiation, maybe you don't invade Italy. What the whole what ifs is, what would the Italians do once Hitler's gone?
But then Churchill probably would have invaded Italy, or
he couldn't do without the American support. So the Americans there wouldn't be enough shipping. So the Americans are perhaps doing Japan first. Let's come and sort out these Germans. Maybe they'll sort themselves out. I mean,
just going back to D-Day, so would they have had the same amount of manpower on D-Day if they'd have changed to go Japan first?
Well, what I was going to say was if they went Japan first, in principle they had a Europe first. Well, not in the actual timeline they had a Europe first principle. In reality, it was let's do both at the same time. Made no difference. You can't. Once the American economy is geared up for war, it's geared up for war. It's not geared up for war for just over there and just over here. And they did shuffle.
So if the Allies saw the Germans holding the Russians up, so let's make the assumption that the Germans would have built a better defensive strategy, and because they got more arms, more people.
Well, it was more
the
question
that they retreated
of using military principles rather than nonsense.
Right. So say because they had some very capable generals, no doubt about that. They're holding up the Russians or slowing them down significantly. Would they even have, based on the fact that the atomic bomb was always destined for Berlin, why have a D-Day? You could just let
Well, because it may not have
bombing
worked.
was happening.
It may not have worked. I mean, that was our very first podcast, guys.
No, I know it was, but they assumed it was going to work.
Well, no, but militarily, you never put all of your eggs in one.
All right, well, the atomic bomb hasn't worked, so therefore we're going to have to commit hundreds of thousands of people and accept the casualties.
A, you don't know if it's going to work. B, you don't know when it's going to be available. So you see, militarily, you never put all your eggs in one basket. So
all I'm saying is you've got Germany contained on Europe. In Europe, you're not losing. You're bombing them day and night. So the Allied casualties are really, in the air forces. There's no ground war in the American and British side.
If we presume that Italy's not been invaded, yeah.
So there's only the Russians who are taking casualties. You've got a weapon of mass destruction that's in the pipeline. You could say, well, look, let's if it comes through, we'll drop it on Berlin. If it doesn't, then we'll invade.
Yeah, but you're forgetting what the Germans are doing while you're sitting around waiting.
Well, what are they doing? They're
building V1s. They're building V1s and V2s and V3s, and they might even resurrect their nuclear weapon program, their atomic bomb program.
I know we've never done one on that, but that was never going to happen.
Correct. Well, I wouldn't say it was never going to happen, but
they were never going to have a nuclear.
I wouldn't say never, but it certainly was going nowhere.
Well, on the podcast I've listened to, it would have been a chance in a million based on how the competitive approach was.
But if you got to remember that the V1 and V2 attacks on southern England only stopped when there was the British and Canadian armies moved up the French and Dutch coast. Though, if you didn't have any D-Day, you'd be getting pummeled every day by V1s and V2s.
Some people could argue, well, that's a small price to pay for 500,000 men, blah, blah, blah.
Well,
Japan first.
It's not. Yeah, but it's not a small price because it's not only is it killing. Well, it killed about 60,000 civilians anyway. But not only is it killing civilians, it's destroying your ability to launch D-Day. You can't launch D-Day if Portsmouth's being destroyed, Southampton's being destroyed. So they obviously they knew of these weapons, but they didn't know when they were going to be deployed. But again, it's if you can do something to your enemy, you do it. You don't sit around waiting for something else to come along.
No, but there's a significant amount of investment in men and materials to do D-Day for some. Anyway.
Correct. No, 100%. I agree. I mean, this is why we discuss these things. It's distinctly possible. Let's put it this way: had you sat around waiting for the atomic bomb and it was 2 years late and didn't work, you'd be kicking yourself. Why didn't help?
Absolutely.
Why didn't we invent?
So those plans France? Would have at least progressed.
Yeah.
It's interesting.
And you wouldn't want to be the person justifying that to a Senate committee.
So one of the things that we haven't covered, and we can do this as a last thing since we're coming right to the end. This has gone on longer than I was expecting. So
5 years, John. 5 years, Second World War. But,
yeah. What do you think a coup d'etat in Germany would have done to the Holocaust?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, by 1943, hundreds of thousands, probably a million or two, had been killed by highly unpleasant means. But that any means were pleasant, but just ad hoc shooting people, clubbing them to death, horrendous. It hadn't the death camps, which were, as opposed to the concentration camps where people died of disease and brutality, the literal death camps where people turned up and were dead within half an hour. They were just about getting going. So you could argue they were built, they were starting, but they had another year to go, and then the Russians took them over, ran over the ground. So.
But it was a Nazi thing, wasn't it?
Well, yes, it was, but anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism was.
Didn't it?
Well, anti-Semitism was rife in many countries. I mean, it was most countries, if truth be told.
Yeah,
but the mechanical process of killing people en masse was pretty unusual and unique to the Nazis. I get that. I suspect they would have stopped it, but the problem they've got is, what did he do with the people who have killed the 2 million people by shooting them and clubbing them to death and all the rest of it?
Send them to the Russian front, probably.
Well, possibly. So I think it's possible. You'd like to think so.
I can't see that they would have carried
You'd like to think that. Yeah,
I can't see what was the purpose. It was just something evil with Hitler.
What was the purpose? I know what was the. Yeah, you're right. I mean, there is no purpose to it other than.
Yeah, so why would a military leadership?
You'd like to think it would stop, but then on the other hand, they pretend it never happened. They pretend it never happened, and you know nothing about it. So how can you stop something that you pretend to know nothing about?
Yeah, but they weren't in charge then, and they're in charge now.
Well.
They can't pretend.
There's a whole other conversation there. The German army, not just the German army, shot as many Jews and peasants as the SS ever did, despite what modern day films and even older films, if you believe. It wasn't always just the SS and Einsatzgruppen killing people. The German army, at the very least, held their coats while they did it, and in many cases, figuratively, and in many cases joined in. But yeah, you're right. But it is quite difficult to say, well, you're stopping this now. Why didn't you stop it last year? Well, I wasn't in charge. Well, I was only obeying orders. Was not deemed to be a defence. But that wouldn't have stopped them doing it. And you'd like to think that they would have done.
Well, on that bombshell, we've come to the end. So that one, interesting.
Yeah, and I promise one day, John, I will. I mean, you're not here to persuade me, but one day. The Second World War will finish in a different way other than somebody dropping an atomic bomb in Berlin.
We'll have to think of the what if for that one. Well, we did have the one.
Well, we did have one because we had
the very first one.
The very first one, it didn't work. I mean, they wouldn't have dropped it on Clunk. It didn't work on Berlin. I mean, obviously they wouldn't have attacked in the first place. But so I think that one ended with the Russians in Cali, which was
that's right. Yeah.
Yeah, it was quite disturbing. But yeah,
that's right. So just as a quickie, I just wanted to say. We always talk about our analytics, and there are areas that we haven't spoken about, which was the UK and India. So thanks to our UK and India listeners. Hopefully you're enjoying this episode too.
Yeah, and
not episode 2, this episode as well.
TWO and to our listeners in Quebec and Australia, keep listening, and the ones in the UK. Although unfortunately at the moment it's only England. We'll have to think of something Scottish to get the blood really boiling in my sense, but Get some interest there.
Right, so thanks everybody. We'll speak to you, or hopefully you'll be listening to us again soon. Bye for now.
Bye.
That's it. Now, we want to hear what you think. So those of you who are part of the Twitterati or X-rated or whatever it is these days, you can leave your comments, good or bad, at ORC_time. We love your feedback. Remember, if you liked this podcast, tell your friends. And if you didn't, tell your friends.